Our next informal fallacy of presumption is a fallacy that's oftentimes difficult to detect because it has the same logical form as a commonly recognized valid deductive argument, a disjunctive syllogism. Now, a disjunctive syllogism is a three-line argument, a syllogism, that has as one of its premises a disjunction, a statement that says either this is true or this is true. Then, as its second premise, it argues that one of those possibilities can't be true. The first possibility is false. And it concludes, therefore, one of them has to be true. The first possibility is false. Therefore, the other possibility has to be true. And disjunctive syllogisms have such currency that Arthur Conan Doyle has Sherlock Holmes explain that kind of argument in one of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, where he says, how many times have I told you, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, has to be the truth, or paraphrased anyway. So these are very common forms of argument. The difference between a false dichotomy and a disjunctive syllogism is that in a disjunctive syllogism, you're presented with two possibilities. Those two possibilities are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. One of them is true or the other is true, and those are the only possibilities. So if you eliminate one, it has to be the other. In the case of a false dichotomy, you're presented with a bunch of possibilities. The arguer eliminates all but one, concludes that one has to be the true one. However, that presentation of the possibilities, say a disjunction, this one or this one, those possibilities aren't mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. That is, it's not the case that only one could be true and that there are no other possibilities. And it's because that disjunction is false, but framed in the context of the argument in such a way that it just is implicitly asserted to be true, that the argument seems more convincing than it actually is. So here's an example. Right? Either you're a beer-swilling wreck of a student or you're a butt smoocher. You're sober, and you're a butt smoocher. Right? This, of course, is a terrible argument. It's a false dichotomy. We know it's a false dichotomy because there's got to be other possibilities. CSULB students generally not beer-swilling wrecks of the students, generally not butt smoochers either. Right? So there are other possibilities that this argument implicitly rules out, doesn't present to you, suppresses, thereby making it seem like it establishes its conclusion by eliminating only one possibility. And this is the key to a false dichotomy. You present a series of possibilities, you implicitly assert in the context of the argument, these are the only possibilities, there has to be one of these, it can't be more than one. You eliminate all but one, and you conclude that the remainder, the one that you haven't eliminated, that has to be true. But if you've got more possibilities, the argument is unsound. It's got a false premise. So say you want to go to a particular movie this week with your significant other, and you know that your significant other isn't going to like this movie or doesn't think much of this movie. You could commit the fallacy of false dichotomy. So you get a hold of the newspaper or you're controlling the computer and you read off all the possibilities, all the different movies you could see, but you only list the ones you know your significant other doesn't want to see, and you argue against all these ones and you conclude the one you want to see is the only one. Therefore, we'll have to go see this one then. All right? So that's how the argument of false dichotomy works. Our next argument is called the fallacy of suppressed evidence or incomplete evidence, or sometimes cherry picking. And the idea behind this argument is that it suppresses. It doesn't explain, doesn't introduce, doesn't provide the appropriate context for information that would make the argument much weaker, maybe even undermine it completely, so that it seems to establish its conclusion because it ignores or doesn't tell you about all the evidence that runs contrary to the truth of its conclusion. So here's an example from the history of testimony before Congress about the relationship between smoking and cancer. So paid scientists, tobacco company executives used to go before Congress on a regular basis, and they would say something like this: look, we have no reason to suppose that smoking causes cancer, since there's never been a double-blind randomized study that showed a positive correlation in human beings between smoking and cancer. Now, strictly speaking, that's true, but it's not true because there isn't a correlation. It's true because it's immoral to perform those kinds of experiments. So a double-blind experiment is when the subjects and the experimenter, neither one knows which group you're in. Randomized is when you take your experimental subjects, you randomly assign them to two groups: a control group, a group who doesn't do the thing, and an experimental manipulation group, in this case a group that smokes. Right? And then you have the smoking group smoke, you have the non-smoking group not smoke, and you wait to see if they have a difference in the rates of, say, lung cancer. But of course, this is profoundly immoral. Right? It's not an experiment that you could do. Why? Well, it's about 1,000,000 times worse than when your roommate says, hey, I think this milk smells bad. Taste it. Right? No, I don't want to taste that milk. I think this might kill you. Try it. I want to find out. Of course, that's immoral. And so there aren't studies like that. And so this premise is true, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And if we knew other things, we would know that it doesn't establish that there is no link between smoking and cancer. Now, there are 3 ways you can suppress evidence. You can neglect negative evidence. You can just not tell people evidence that undermines or weakens your case. You can quote evidence out of context, right? And this is a nice example of that, right? They tell you there's no double-blind studies that show a correlation, but they don't tell you because that's because there are no double-blind studies. It's immoral, right? And then the 3rd way that people often do it is to ignore how the passage of time has altered a relationship. And of course, in the smoking case, when we look more carefully at the evidence, we realize that there are suppressed evidence in 2 of those 3 ways. Right? So they've neglected the negative evidence. So there are plenty of animal studies where animals are exposed to cigarette smoke and they develop higher rates of lung cancer. And there are plenty of descriptive studies where instead of assigning people to groups, you let them, what they say, self-select. Then you follow them through their lives and you see what the differences are. When you see a difference, you try and get 2 groups from your overall pool that are exactly the same with regard to everything pretty much except that one feature, in this case, smoking. Right? And then you look and see, is there a higher rate? And sure enough, in descriptive studies, people who smoke are 16 times more likely to develop lung cancer, for instance, than people who don't smoke. And so there's lots of evidence. And these arguers neglect that evidence. They quote the evidence that they do quote out of context. They tell you there's no double-blind randomized studies that show a positive correlation, but they don't tell you why that is. Once they tell you why that is, it doesn't support smoking doesn't cause cancer anymore. The one thing they don't do is talk about something in a way that ignores how the passage of time has altered a relationship.